On October 31st, 2010, AMC aired the pilot episode of The Walking Dead, a live-action zombie drama based on the best-selling comic series by Robert Kirkman and artist Tony Moore. The show went on to be one of the most watched television shows of all time, achieving widespread popularity and cultural significance, only to then slowly fizzle out over the course of several lackluster seasons. Yet despite all of this, AMC's Walking Dead franchise continues to shamble on like a zombie, with spin-off shows still being released to this day. And unsurprisingly, the show still has quite the sizable fan base, a fan base which often ponders how they would personally fare against the Walker apocalypse. Many fans are convinced that they'd survive, others believe they'd perish, and quite a few think that the wildfire virus would be a cakewalk, to the point where society wouldn't even collapse. And you know what? Since this topic is so damn interesting, I've decided to tackle this question myself. Now, in order to answer whether or not you'd survive the wildfire virus, I'm gonna have to cover a few topics before I reach my conclusion. I'm also going to base this thought experiment on the notion that you're an average person within the Walking Dead universe, and not some overly prepared doomsday prepper. And since you're just an average person within this fictional world, you too will have no conceptualization of what zombies are or could be. Because within the lore of The Walking Dead is the canon reality that the people of that world have literally never thought up of zombies, so you're not going to have access to advantageous intel as well. With that being made clear, let's begin by looking at how the wildfire virus functions as a pathogen. The wildfire virus, before it mutated to the point where it would reanimate the dead, was an airborne pathogen that managed to infect, in the words of Dr. Edwin Jenner, everyone on Earth. It would lay dormant with no symptoms being manifested until the host expired. If the brain remained intact at the point of expiration, the virus would work its way into the brain, in a way that's similar to meningitis. And given a few minutes to a few hours, the deceased host will eventually reanimate and become a walker, which means that everyone turns, no matter how they died, if their brains aren't destroyed. If the host happens to be bitten by a walker, then the virus will actively invade the brain as the patient is still alive. The adrenal glands will begin to hemorrhage, the brain then starts to shut down, with major organs following suit. And then, eventually, the patient will die, and then they will eventually reanimate into a zombie. If infected walker blood enters your bloodstream through an open injury, then it's possible for you to turn as well. You don't just need to get bitten to turn. Now, if you're lucky enough to be exposed to the right amount of radiation, you might just be able to survive being bitten, which is precisely what happened to the hottie that is Alicia Clark. And if you amputate a bitten limb fast enough, you can prevent the virus from overtaking the bitten victim. Now, these zombies have insane longevity, to the point where they're still around years into the apocalypse, seemingly being unaffected by their apparent decomposition. They do slow down over time, however, in terms of movement speed, but during the early stages of the outbreak, these fuckers were fast shamblers. Some of these early variants were also smart enough to use rocks and climb fucking fences. They're also strong enough to rip you apart quite easily, and they're durable enough to sustain all forms of damage, so long as their brains remain intact. They happen to be attracted to light, noise, and smell, and they also like to eat animals. They also travel in mass hordes, which can level large wooden walls if the horde is of a sufficient size. As time progresses, walkers will lay dormant on the ground as lurkers, only to reawaken when a potential meal stumbles across them. It is theorized that walkers can carry diseases, as many believe that's how the flu infected the prison group. They are also unaffected by radiation as well. So whenever one is exposed to high levels of radiation, they become a walking cancer-spreading machine. Some of them will turn into burners with acid in their bodies and on their skin. If you experiment enough with these fuckers, you can make them run as well. Then there's also a literal cornucopia of variant walkers who are just special because weird shit happened to them or because people slapped some armor on them. That being said, you can avoid these undead pricks by showering yourself in their guts, or by having two of them tied to chains with their arms and jaws cut off. You can also fool these morons by skinning the face of a walker and wearing it like a mask. And if you're talented enough, you'll be able to whisper to these freaks and control them like some demented puppeteer. Now, if you live up north, you could always wait until winter for these things to freeze, at which point killing them is rather easy. Oh, and this should be obvious, but you can only really kill these things by destroying their brains. So now that we sufficiently understand the wildfire virus itself, and the walkers it produces, we can now begin to understand our chances of survival. But the one aspect of this zombie apocalypse that people generally fail to grasp is the severity of the outbreak itself. Plenty of fans, and even prominent YouTubers, have propagated the smooth-brained narrative that this zombie apocalypse would be short-lived and easily survivable. The people who say this often fail to recognize two important variables, with the first being that the people in this fictional world have never once imagined anything like a zombie. These people would have zero intuition for dealing with this undead threat. Everyone would be learning at the same exact time, all starting from a completely clean slate. The second variable that these folks tend to overlook is the variable of exponential growth, which is the single greatest variable that makes all zombie apocalypses a real nightmare. Remember that by the time the wildfire virus starts to reanimate dead bodies, everyone was already infected. This means that on day one, we'd see the outbreak begin not with a bite, but with natural deaths. The average deaths per day in the United States is roughly 8,000. That means on day one, we'd have 8,000 walkers roaming the streets of America, and the majority of them would likely be in densely populated areas, as that's where most people in America live. If we were to assume that each walker is able to bite or infect 5 people per day, we'd then see the number of walkers increase to 48,000 by the start of day 2. Now that sounds like a lot, but it really isn't when you spread the walkers throughout the continental United States. Day 2, on the other hand, would see the population of zombies reach 288,000, which is literally more than 250,000. By now, people would start to hear about these attacks on the news. Many would see clips on social media, but there would be widespread skepticism about the nature of these attacks. No one would really know why these assaults are happening, nor would they know to bug out. Day 3 would see the American walker population explode to 1.72 million. This would cause civil unrest throughout the nation, with major outbreaks occurring in multiple major cities. Getting the National Guard and military properly deployed in less than 24 hours to multiple cities within the United States wouldn't be easy, and the government would hesitate to establish martial law in fear of inducing widespread panic. By the time that government officials decide to bite the bullet and risk people losing their shit, day 4 would be over and the zombie population would hit 10.368 million. And this is all assuming that each walker manages to bite or infect just 5 people, when it's highly likely that some walkers accomplish far more than just 5. Now, I'm well aware of the many issues with this example, but the point I'm trying to make is that the spread of this outbreak would be like a fucking wildfire. By the time the government even recognizes that something is happening, entire supply chains, lines of communication, utility infrastructure, and all of society would have collapsed. The walkers don't just spawn in one location. They spawn every time someone dies, whether it be from natural causes, violence, accidents, or walker bites. Which means the spread of this contagion will probably be even worse than the example I've just given, which doesn't account for the extra 8,000 natural deaths on average per day, or the deaths from the accidents and civil unrest that we would see. At some point, people will not show up to work at power plants. They won't show up to work on farms, nor will people show up to work in other critical economic infrastructure job posts. The outbreak will literally begin on a map as tiny embers in every major city, with some barely noticeable specks in small rural towns. And these embers, in short order, will eventually grow into raging fires that will consume all of civilization. If you doubt this, then you've never seen how easy it is for society to collapse, even on a smaller scale. The military just can't be deployed everywhere at once. That's not how it works. And the anarchy that results from the Great Panic is what will ultimately lead to the fall of civilization, as people will starve, die of dehydration, die to exposure, die as a result of accidents, or they will be killed by desperate survivors or violent marauders, let alone the walker threat. And these people, every single one of them, will turn and join Team Walker, further exacerbating the spread of the outbreak. And with no one knowing what is happening or how to properly deal with it, shit will just continue to hit the fan at terminal fucking velocity. Anyone telling you that this would be a cakewalk is just fucking ignorant. Exponential growth is a bitch, especially when no one knows how to actually stop that growth from happening. Now, is this the worst zombie apocalypse ever? Of course not, but it certainly wouldn't be a cakewalk. There's actually a good chance for you to die in the initial outbreak. So with all of that said, could you survive this specific zombie outbreak? The answer is, of course you can, but it wouldn't be easy. You would have to survive the initial outbreak, the civil unrest that comes from it, and then the actual fall of civilization itself. This, of course, would be exacerbated by the military if it decides to conduct Operation Cobalt, just like it did in the actual lore of the series, where said military started killing civvies and bombing cities. Once you survive all of that, you're gonna have to survive what comes after. The walkers aren't going away for quite some fucking time, so you're gonna have to join or start a community. And if you don't have any useful survival skills, or if you're not good at or okay with killing the undead and even the living, then you're eventually going to die. And the longer you survive in this new world, the more difficult things will get before they get easier. Antibiotics will eventually run out. Gasoline will eventually expire. Generators will eventually break down. Photovoltaic panels will eventually degrade. Automobiles will eventually be rendered inoperable. Highways and roads will start to decay, and buildings will eventually begin to collapse without maintenance. Life will literally return to a pre-industrial era, with very few communities retaining post-industrial luxuries. You'll be living in a world where a simple failed appendix will end your run, where a simple cut could end you via infection. We're talking about a world without emergency alert systems that can save you from being wiped out by a tornado or hurricane or blizzard. We're literally talking about a world where modern farming has completely collapsed. Millions of people will starve simply because there won't be the modern logistics, technology, and productive capacity to feed all of them. And to be quite blunt, most of you are not equipped to live in such a world. You may think that you are, but you most certainly are not. Be that as it may, when all things are considered, this apocalypse is not as bad as many other zombie apocalypses, like say Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead apocalypse, which is one I covered in the video at the top corner of the screen. And while most of you would die eventually, a great many of you would improvise, adapt, and overcome. In fact, I feel confident in saying that roughly 10% of you would go on to survive and rebuild the world. And despite that figure sounding low, it sure as hell is better than some of the crazy fucking zombie apocalypses in fiction. Now, if y'all went into this with full knowledge from the get-go, I'd wager that 40 to 48% of you would survive in the long run. Still definitely not some cakewalk. I've seen how some of you newbies play Zomboid, despite having a metric fuck ton of zombie acumen. Shit's much harder in practice than it sounds, and let's be real, Zomboid isn't as hard as the real thing. Anyways, if you like this sort of content, please like, share, and subscribe. Click the bell as well, that way you may be notified whenever I publish a new video. And also remember that you may opine anytime if you feel so inclined, down in the comment section. I'm Captain Gold and hope to see you in my next Gold Standard video.